I made this cutting board a year ago, and since then it's gotten a lot of use. Today I'm going to walk through the process of how I refinish my cutting boards and make them look brand new again. This process will work with any wood cutting board, handmade or store-bought. The first thing I do is use my random orbital sander with 80 grit sandpaper to get rid of the deep knife marks. You can see how the sander removes all the scratches along with the mineral oil that was soaked into the wood. To prevent the cutting board from moving around while sanding, I like to use a piece of drawer liner on my bench. Then I spray the backside of the liner with water. This creates friction and helps to keep my workpiece in place as I sand. For smaller pieces like this, because they're so light, the drawer liner doesn't always keep them in place. So here I'm using Rockler bench cookies. I do think that the drawer liner also helps to keep the bench cookies in place. Once I'm done sanding with the 80 grit sandpaper, I move on to 120, 180, then 220. In between each grit, I mark the cutting board with pencil. I like to write the grit number on the cutting board, like 120 or 180. I learned this from many of the other woodworking videos on YouTube. Usually the pencil marks are to ensure that you've sanded the entire piece thoroughly with that grit, but the main reason I like to mark my cutting boards with pencil is because it helps me keep track of which sides that I've sanded. I also sand the edges of the cutting board with my random orbital sander, just like this. I do this for each grit other than 80 grit. Once I get to 220 grit, I redo the edges with my router. Using a 1/4 inch round over bit, I set the depth of the router so that it's just barely touching the wood. Then, after each pass, I lower the router bit a little more until I like the look. Now I write 220 on the cutting board with my pencil, and I spray it with water. At this point, I've sanded the cutting board from 80 to 220 grit, and I've rerouted the edges. I skipped this step when I made my very first cutting board, and after I washed it for the first time, it was rough and it felt like it hadn't been sanded at all. So, whether you're making a cutting board for the first time or refinishing a cutting board, make sure you spray it with water and get the grain to rise up. Once the water dries, I come back with my router and go over the edges one last time. With this step, I don't adjust the depth of the bit any further. After raising the grain with water, I notice that my router shaves off some of the wood that rose up. Next, I secure the cutting board in my vise and I wrap a sanding sponge with 180 grit sandpaper because it conforms to the rounded edges of the cutting board. Then, to avoid scratch marks running against the wood grain, I use a piece of sandpaper and run it back and forth in the direction of the grain. Now I sand both sides and all the edges with 220 grit sandpaper again. Lastly, I sand all the surfaces one last time with 400 grit sandpaper. I like to sand the top and bottom with my random orbital sander last, so it can clean up any scratch marks left behind from sanding the edges by hand. After vacuuming all the dust off the cutting board, I finish it with some tung oil. I pour a little on, and then I rub it in. I make sure that the end grain is completely covered. Until this point, I've always used mineral oil to finish my cutting boards, but according to the Wood Whisperer, tung oil lasts longer and provides better protection than most other food-safe wood finishes. I let this sit for 24 hours and then wipe off the excess. This is what it looked like before. And here's what it looks like now. I hope you got something out of this video. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. I'd also love to hear your feedback. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.